The Six-Day War, also known as the June War, 1967 Arab-Israeli War, or Third Arab-Israeli War, was fought between June 5 and 10, 1967 by Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Relations between Israel and its neighbors had never fully normalized following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. In the period leading up to June 1967, tensions became dangerously heightened. In reaction to the mobilization of Egyptian forces along the Israeli border in the Sinai Peninsula, Israel launched a series of preemptive airstrikes against Egyptian airfields. The Egyptians were caught by surprise, and nearly the entire Egyptian air force was destroyed with few Israeli losses, giving the Israelis air superiority. Simultaneously, the Israelis launched a ground offensive into the Gaza Strip and the Sinai, which again caught the Egyptians by surprise. After some initial resistance, Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser ordered the evacuation of the Sinai. Israeli forces rushed westward in pursuit of the Egyptians, inflicted heavy losses, and conquered the Sinai. Nasser induced Syria and Jordan to begin attacks on Israel by using the initially confused situation to claim that Egypt had defeated the Israeli airstrike. Israeli counterattacks resulted in the seizure of East Jerusalem as well as the West Bank from the Jordanians, while Israel's retaliation against Syria resulted in its occupation of the Golan Heights. On June 11, a ceasefire was signed. Arab casualties were far heavier than those of Israel. Fewer than 1,000 Israelis had been killed compared to over 20,000 from the Arab forces. Israel's military success was attributed to the element of surprise, an innovative and well-executed battle plan, and the poor quality and leadership of the Arab forces. Israel seized control of the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israeli morale and international prestige was greatly increased by the outcome of the war, and the area under Israeli control tripled. However, the speed and ease of Israel's victory would lead to a dangerous overconfidence within the ranks of the IDF, contributing to initial Arab successes in the subsequent 1973 Yom Kippur War. The displacement of civilian populations resulting from the war would have long-term consequences, as 300,000 Palestinians fled the West Bank and about 100,000 Syrians left the Golan to become refugees. Across the Arab world, Jewish minority communities were expelled, with refugees going to Israel or Europe. Background: after the 1956 Suez Crisis, Egypt agreed to the stationing of a United Nations emergency force in the Sinai to ensure all parties would comply with the 1949 armistice agreements. In the following years there were numerous minor border clashes between Israel and its Arab neighbors, particularly Syria. In early November 1966, Syria signed a mutual defense agreement with Egypt. Soon thereafter, in response to Palestine Liberation Organization guerrilla activity, including a mine attack that left 3 dead, the Israeli Defense Force attacked the village of Az-Samu in the Jordanian-occupied West Bank. Jordanian units that engaged the Israelis were quickly beaten back. King Hussein of Jordan criticized Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser for failing to come to Jordan's aid, and hiding behind UNEF skirts. In May 1967, Nasser received false reports from the Soviet Union that Israel was massing on the Syrian border. Nasser began massing his troops in 2 defensive lines in the Sinai Peninsula on Israel's border, expelled a UNEF force from Gaza and Sinai, and took up UNEF positions at Sharm el-Sheikh overlooking the Straits of Tiran. Israel reiterated reiterated declarations made in 1957 that any closure of the straits would be considered an act of war or justification for war, and NASA declared the straits closed to Israeli shipping on May 22, 23. On May 30, Jordan and Egypt signed a defense pact. The following day, at Jordan's invitation, the Iraqi army began deploying troops and armored units in Jordan. They were later reinforced by an Egyptian contingent. On June 1, Israel formed a national unity government by widening its cabinet, and on June 4 the decision was made to go to war. The next morning, Israel launched Operation Focus, a large-scale surprise airstrike that was the opening of the Six-Day War. Military preparation. Before the war, Israeli pilots and ground crews had trained extensively in rapid refitting of aircraft returning from sorties, enabling a single aircraft to sortie up to 4 times a day. This enabled the Israeli Air Force to send several attack waves against Egyptian airfields on the first day of the war, overwhelming the Egyptian Air Force, and allowed it to knock out other Arab air forces on the same day. This has contributed to the Arab belief that the RAF was helped by foreign air forces. Pilots were extensively schooled about the targets, and were forced to memorize every single detail, and rehearsed the operation multiple times on dummy runways in total secrecy. The Egyptians had constructed fortified defenses in the Sinai. These designs were based on the assumption that an attack would come along the few roads leading through the desert, rather than through the difficult desert terrain. The Israelis chose not to risk attacking the Egyptian defenses head-on, and instead surprised them from an unexpected direction. James Reston, writing in the New York Times on May 23, 1967, noted, in discipline, training, morale, equipment and general competence, his army and the other Arab forces, without the direct assistance of the Soviet Union, are no match for the Israelis. Even with 50,000 troops and the best of his generals and air force in Yemen, he has not been able to work his way in that small and primitive country, and even his effort to help the Congo rebels was a flop. On May 26, 1967, the CIA estimated, the Israelis, if they attacked now, they would still be able to drive the Egyptians away from the entrance to the Strait of Tyran, but it would certainly cost them heavy losses of men and materiel. On the eve of the war, Israel believed it could win a war in 3 to 4 days. The United States estimated Israel would need 7 to 10 days to win, with British estimates supporting the U.S. view. Our armies and weapons. Armies. The Israeli army had a total strength, including reservists, of 264,000, though this number could not be sustained, as the reservists were vital to civilian life. Against Jordan's forces on the West Bank, Israel deployed about 40,000 troops and 200 tanks. Israeli Central Command forces consisted of 5 brigades. The first 2 were permanently stationed near Jerusalem and were called the Jerusalem Brigade and the mechanized Hale Brigade. Mordecai Go's 55th Paratroopers Brigade was summoned from the Sinai front. The 10th Armored Brigade was stationed north of the West Bank. The Israeli Northern Command provided a division led by Major General Elad Peld, which was stationed in the Jezreel Valley to the north of the West Bank. On the eve of the war, Egypt massed approximately 100,000 of its 160,000 troops in the Sinai, including all of its 7 divisions, 4 independent infantry brigades and 4 independent independent armored brigades. No fewer than a third of them were veterans of Egypt's continuing intervention into the North Yemen civil war, and another third were reservists. These forces had 950 tanks, 1,100 APCs, and more than 1,000 artillery pieces. Syria's army had a total strength of 75,000 and was deployed along the Syrian border. The Jordanian armed forces included 11 brigades, totaling 55,000 troops and equipped with some 300 modern Western tanks, 250 of which were U.S. M48 patterns. 9 brigades were deployed in the West Bank, including the elite armored 40th, and 2 in the Jordan Valley. They possess sizable numbers of M113 APCs, a new battalion of mechanized infantry, and a paratrooper battalion trained in the new U.S.-built school. They also had 12 battalions of artillery and 6 batteries of 81 mm and 120 mm mortars. The Jordanian Army, then known as the Arab Legion, was a long-term service professional army, relatively well-equipped and well-trained. Furthermore, Israeli post-war briefings said that the Jordanian staff acted professionally as well, but was always left half a step behind by the Israeli moves. The small Royal Jordanian Air Force consisted of only 24 British-made Hawker Hunter fighters, 6 transports, and 2 helicopters. According to the Israelis, the Hawker Hunter was essentially on par with the French-built Dassault Mirage 3, the IAF's best plane. 100 Iraqi tanks and an infantry division were readied near the Jordanian border. 2 squadrons of fighter aircraft, Hawker Hunters and MiG-21s, were rebased adjacent to the Jordanian border. The Arab Air Forces were aided by volunteer pilots from the Pakistan Air Force acting in independent capacity, and by some aircraft from Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia to make up for the massive losses suffered on the first day of the war. PAF pilots shot down several Israeli planes. Weapons. With the exception of Jordan, the Arabs relied principally on Soviet weaponry. Jordan's army was equipped with American weaponry, and its air force was composed of British aircraft. Egypt had by far the largest and the most modern of all the Arab air forces, consisting of about 420 combat aircraft, all of them Soviet-built and with a heavy quota of top-of-the-line MiG-21s. Of particular concern to the Israelis were the 32-16 Badger medium bombers, capable of inflicting heavy damage on Israeli military and civilian centers. Israeli weapons were mainly of Western origin. Its air force was composed principally of French aircraft, while its armored units were mostly of British and American design and manufacture. Some infantry weapons, including the ubiquitous Uzi, were of Israeli origin.